Welcome to Some Things Considered, the podcast where we are obsessed with story. We celebrate creativity and we talk to cool people to find out what makes them tick. I'm your host, Sean Murphy. I'm an author. I direct the Center for Story at Shenandoah University, and I run the nonprofit 1455 Lit Arts. For more about me and what I do, check out seanmurphy.net. Hey, everybody. Welcome back to Some Things Considered. This is the podcast where we are obsessed with creativity. We love to dive deeply into story making, how it happens, why it happens, who makes it, who receives it, etc. I'm Sean Murphy, your host. I'm a writer. I direct the Center for Story at Shenandoah University, and I run the arts nonprofit 1455. For more about me, you can check it out at seanmurphy.net. But the connecting theme of all of these things I do is talking about the ways culture intersects with creativity. And as such, I seek out people that know more than me, are smarter than me, and are cooler than me, and have a conversation about what makes them tick. I am super thrilled today to have a real expert that I'm going to learn from. I can only imagine how much knowledge she's about to drop. Let me introduce Leah Paulos. Leah is the founder of Press Shop PR and Book Publicity School. She's worked at the intersection of books and media for over 25 years. Twice named a top PR firm by The Observer, Press Shop PR has worked on many notable books and #1 bestsellers by some luminaries you may have heard of, including Representative John Lewis, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, Neil deGrasse Tyson, and many others. She's spoken on book publicity at Columbia Journalism School, CUNY Graduate Center, and many other venues, and on literary podcasts. Leah, thank you for coming on this podcast. It's an absolute delight to be with you. And my only sense of nervousness and urgency is I got so many things I want to talk about. We got to try to cram it in. But thank you for being here. It's wonderful to be in conversation with you.
Well, thank you so much for having me and for that lovely intro.
My pleasure. You did all the work. I just read it. So
It
let
did sound
let's
familiar.
let's get right at like I purposely keep the bios brief, but you've got a lot to brag about. But I also think what better way to kick things off than to talk about, you mentioned this intersection of books and media. That intersection has only become more pronounced, and yet also I think in some ways more complicated and confusing. But talk us through your background and how you got from book lover to book promoter and all the things in between.
Yeah, so I am actually one of the rare book publicists or independent book publicists that never worked in-house at a publishing house. So I got my start in magazines and working as a journalist, as a writer and editor. Um, I do think that that gave me a very different perspective. I was never sort of schooled in the way of doing book publicity that they do in-house. And, not knocking in-house publicists at all. I mean, they do amazing, incredible work. But, the thing that publishing and media have changed so tremendously over the past decades. And when you think about book publicity, that it falls squarely at that intersection. It's media and publishing. So these two industries have undergone this tremendous transformation. And yet, when it comes to promoting books via publicity and media outreach, the publishing world is just kind of slow to adapt. It's a big industry. There's a lot of, you know, inertia. So I think it was really, really helpful to not to come from that space at a time when everything was changing so fast.
Yeah.
So the skills that I sort of got from being a writer and editor, they all help. I mean, it was the best training possible for being a publicist because when you are a publicist, it is all about storytelling. It's about figuring out how to tell a really compelling story that is going to fit into a particular outlet. And I learned how to do that as an editor. We had to do that all the time. We'd have to field queries from, our freelance writers or publicists or, just ideas we came up with. But you have to put it into a story. That is your job, is to make a story of it. So it's really is a very similar skill set. And then the other piece of publicity, of course, is not just the good storytelling, but then who are you going to send that great piece of storytelling about a book to? You have to get it to the right person. And so coming up in the media space, working as an editor, I knew that. So that was actually really fantastic training. And then I made the switch over to doing publicity from journalism, and I kind of lucked into my first book client. It was a man named Frank Delaney, absolutely incredible writer. He wrote the bestseller Ireland. He recently passed away, but I worked with him for 5 years, and that was really my entree into book publicity. And I have just run with it. That was, started back with Frank, God, in the 2000s and sometime, maybe 2006, 7, 8, something like that. And then, I've just made a business of it. There was a real opening for it because, again, all of those spaces were changing so fast. And so it left authors in this sort of uncomfortable position where their role wasn't supported in the same way. All of the parameters around publication were changing, but the support wasn't really changing. So there was a real opening for and a need for outside help to be like, we will help you navigate this and effectively promote your book. So that was really how the business launched. And there just continues to be more, a lot of need for it because the changes in publishing and certainly the changes in media have not slowed down. They have only sped up.
Yeah, and I think we're going to want to dive deeply into what those changes entail and how they impact, both creators and audiences. It's funny, before we came on, I was mentioning that I spent years in the tech industry, and one of the things I think the tech world, because of innovation and just the notion of technology, is things are always changing. There's always disruption, and the disruption can be generally spun as positive. Like the products and the gadgets get bigger or smaller and better and cheaper. So there's this comfort with when a disruption comes along. It's usually there's an element of democracy and the smartest, best thing happening. I think what's one of the myriad things that I've been fascinated by and thinking deeply about these issues on kind of both sides of it is that as it relates to the publishing industry, it is the exact opposite. For decades, people were both able and comforted by people saying, "This is the way it's done. Here's the rules. If you follow the rules and you do the right things, you can reasonably expect these things." And that has completely changed for reasons we can get into,
Mhm.
good and bad. But like the landscape has changed, the internet, social media, there are things that we can point to, but I think that's left both editors and agents, authors and everyone in between. There are no rules anymore. And I think where you emerge as such a bright spot, both in terms of the work you do, but also the knowledge that you can provide, is that so what does one do if one can't suddenly dedicate all of their time to catching up or even just staying abreast of here's how things are changing and here's how you adapt? Because we both know you go on the internet and there's no shortage of people who will say, here's the hack, here's the shortcut. There is no hack. There is no shortcut, but there are best practices. So maybe talk a little bit, if you don't mind, because I think it'll help set the table. Like we talk about these changes for someone that's like, well, what are you guys talking about? Did the internet change everything? Let's talk about how just the world of publishing, like a writer would have a book accepted, which itself was a big deal. My purview on this, having started publishing in the 90s, was that was the goal. You get a book deal, not that you could just check out, but like the pros would take over and you were a writer. You stay in your corner and you wrote your books and you hope for the best and maybe it becomes a bestseller. But I talk to people that are published by the big five now and they're like, the support system, is consolidated, the budgets are gone, the bandwidth isn't there. So maybe walk us through like some of the big changes that you've like lived through on your
Mhm.
side of the fence.
Yeah, no, I mean it is huge. I mean, the publishing industry has this weird business model where they make almost all of their money from their big books and also from their backlist. So that's really what they have to think about. So a lot of their acquisitions, and when you think about it as like an imprint-wide acquiring strategy, it's like they need a book to hit. They don't need every book to do really well. They need a book to just be the big hit, and then they put their resources there, or they assume that that one's going to be the big hit and they put their resources there, and then lo and behold, it is the big hit. So and that might work to keep publishers afloat, but it doesn't work very well for authors because no author wants to just be like a noodle thrown at the wall, like
Yeah.
is it going to stick or is it not? Like no one wants that for their career. So that's really where it becomes even more important for an author to really be proactive or hire someone who's going to be proactive or, just take an active role because, like you said, it is not no longer the case that every author that whose book is acquired, do they have the resources or the budget to promote? So what that looks like is publicists, in-house publicists and marketers having these huge lists where it's like, sometimes it's 4 books, sometimes it's 12 books a season, and there's just nothing really, you can do. That's not feasible. And it's even less feasible beyond the fact that they're so overstretched because budgets in publishing are just the margins are really thin. On top of that, the actual work is more time consuming now because it used to be that, if you published a book in, 1999,
Yeah.
um, there's a number of book review venues, there's newspapers around the country. There's, maybe a list of like 120 book review editors, and every in-house publicist for major imprints, they got the book to those people, and then there would be a certain amount of pickup. Like maybe you'd get the Times, maybe you wouldn't, but then you might get the, Miami Herald or the LA Times or whatever else. Um, most review venues and newspapers have shuttered now. There's just a handful of dedicated book review venues. Um, and, there's just limited book coverage all around at the same time as a huge glut of books because there's so many imprints. Then there's all this self-published and hybrid. And even though the major venues usually won't cover those unless there's, something really like a real story there. But for the most part, they don't cover them. But there's just more noise in the market. So, there's not a clear-cut map anymore. It's not like every book, if you're a publicist in-house and you have 7 books, but you know that like, okay, for the most part, you're going to send it to these 120 people for each one. Like, all right, that's a lot of work, but it's maybe doable-ish. But it's not like that anymore. Most of the book review venues don't exist. And so you really need to promote a book is really go, find that targeted media
Yeah.
list. Like you have to build a targeted media list. You have to look at who might be interested in that book from a topic point of view, who's covered a book that came out recently with a similar subject matter or theme. And that's how you have to do it. You have to look for the great podcasts that are really getting traction, and that's changing all the time. Podcasts come and go, and they pop and they go on hiatus, and all of that stuff is so much more time consuming. You don't have a set list for any one book. So it's like in this environment with all of these changes happening, it's just takes more time at a time when the publisher is able to give less time.
Thank you for that. Yeah, I mean, I think that really kind of underscores like the shifts in the publishing, like from the inside behind the locked gates. What I'm fond of saying, because I think it's true, is that in the 21st century, the good news is that, for all the complications of digital media and the internet, content is readily and often freely available. So if one wants to get one's voice out into the world, there's never been less barrier to entry, and that's a positive thing for society. The other side of that coin, of course, is if everyone's doing it, it's that much easier to get lost in the void. So there's that issue of how do you stand out? And you touched on that a little bit, but then I think it gets to the other thing, which I think everyone accepts now. It was kind of still cutting edge, like news 5, 10 years ago. No author regardless of their platform, can afford to just be aloof. No author in 2025 can say, I'm not a tech person. I don't have a website. I don't really get on social media. Like an author has to be invested. But then what you're talking about, which I'm glad you mentioned, is how does one effectively spend one's time because there aren't, infinite resources and time to research the podcast, to research the book reviewers, the book blogs, etc. That's where an expert comes in. And I think that's where we've set the stage. Like, here's what's happening in the publishing industry, and here's what's happened for any author. The good news, again, like, you could get published, but what's the point of publishing if you're not going to put your best foot forward? So that gets us right into exactly where you come in, especially with your semi outside the box in the sense, and I mean this as both a compliment, and I think this is exactly the kind of disruption we're talking about. Someone that wasn't necessarily brought up in the I was trained by the person that was trained by the person, and this is how it works, because those people are dinosaurs now. So as a
Mhm.
non-dinosaur, you
Mhm.
enter the fray, and you also have to wear a lot of hats, I imagine, even in your lane with publicity.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, there's a ton of stuff going on. I mean, when you not only are there so many different venues, but you also, when you're thinking about a really successful campaign and getting the word out about a book these days, you have to think about a lot of different elements, not just the top shows, but then you have to think about different formats because everybody has their own, news feeds curated, but they also have different formats they like. Like some people always have a podcast in their ear. That's the best way to reach them. It's fantastic. Other people's, and I know people are surprised, probably your listeners are going to be surprised because, they are clearly podcast listeners, but a lot of people don't, especially older people, don't listen to podcasts. And, I cannot tell you how often I have heard like people asking me, like especially older writers, like what's a podcast? Is that like radio? And so you can't just do podcasts. You also have to make sure you are online, and then hopefully, the remaining print that there's some coverage there. And then some people just have all their Substacks. All they do is read Substacks now.
Yeah.
Make sure you're there. So, you need to really be sort of comprehensive in this way. That's not only about topic and type of venue or type of outlet, but also just the particular format. So there is just a lot to do. There are a lot of hats to wear, without a doubt. I think the biggest thing though is really and this is can be hard to hear for authors. A lot of, creatives don't love to hear you need to really think of your book or your creative output as a product, but you do. You have to almost think of it as you are a teeny tiny little entrepreneur when your book comes out, and like you have one product in your business, and you have to think about how to promote it. There's no business in the world that launches and then just sits back and hopes people stumble upon it. Every single business, whether it's a restaurant or a theater production or anything, you think about how do you find the people that are going to be interested in what you're selling, and then proactively get the message to them. And it's no different for authors, especially nowadays.
Yeah.
So
Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
yeah, so I was just gonna say, I know that probably makes a lot of authors, I know it makes a lot of authors cringe and wanna crawl up and just go write another book and forget forget about this one. But it is really important.
Yeah, I mean, we're talking about reality, right? Again, I would say like I'm as old school. Like I went to grad school in the late 80s. Like the idea, and I'm a writer, like the idea of like I just am a writer and I sit in my corner and churn out art and whatever happens, happens. Like one still could be that way, but don't kid yourself. Like it's going to get buried in the tsunami of inferior content. And
Mhm.
why not allow your brilliant book to have the best chance it can? But I'm really glad you used the word entrepreneur because I agree. I think that even just makes non-creatives cringe in the sense that so everything's a sale, but we can start breaking down the semantics. Like, yeah, everything is a sale, everything uses story, everyone is a brand, whether you want to acknowledge that, like all of our social media interactions, we're branding. So being able to demystify these concepts and say you don't have to be impersonal. In fact, it's quite the opposite. But this notion of entrepreneurialism, I do think is anathema to a 20th century model of
Hmm.
art. But the music industry certainly has continues to recognize and reconcile that. The lit
Yeah.
industry is just a decade or two behind in recognizing that the sands have shifted. They're not going back. So it's kind of adapt or die. I think the other thing that makes people like, let's just put it out there. There's always the dream, like when I write my novel, which let's in and of itself, right? Someone that gets to the finish line, such a huge accomplishment, something to be so proud of. Many people start and don't get there. Then you got to get published. Then you got to find readers. But there used to at least be the fantasy of, well, then when that happens, I'll be able to make a living. And a lot of people don't want to hear the fact that not only is it unlikely you'll make a living at this, you're probably going to need to spend some money of your own to give your book the best chance. And I recognize it sounds like a rigged game, but that's the way it's always been for so many art forms. And again, that's where people like you come in and say, I can try to lead you through this vast wilderness, and spend your money wisely, or figure out ways to avoid spending money where you don't need to, or give yourself the best chance to spend your money wisely so you can recoup it via
Mhm.
sales. Again, I will say I've talked to a lot of authors that, I mean, again, let's just get down to brass tacks. I've had conversations with authors, some of them friends, that have gotten the reviews, that have gotten the placements, that have gotten all the things that in a different era would have been like, it's happening. What all I need to do is sit back and count the checks. Those things do not guarantee your readership anymore. So now we're talking about kind of micro targeting audiences within the audience. And I think, again, that's obviously what you are an expert at. I most definitely am not. And I'm kind of always in awe of how you separate, how one goes about targeting micro communities, that are going to be interested in that book, or the message of the book will resonate with them. Talk a little bit about how you went
Yeah, I
about
mean,
that.
I think, yeah, I mean, you're totally right that even the books that sort of get like can check that very exclusive box of like New York Times review, Washington Post review, New Yorker, whatever it is, that's fantastic. But it also just it's not as fantastic as it used to be, because there's just more out there. There's more competition for everything. It's not, maybe 15 years ago, if you got on Fresh Air, um, anyone who gets in their car at, 4 p.m. or whatever time it airs is listening to it, within your potential readers. And now that's not the case. Now, a lot of people get into their car and they're listening to a podcast, or they go to listen to, an audiobook, or they were listening to Sirius XM. It's just there's so many other options, so the audiences are fragmented all around. Um, so, those hits obviously are still huge targets. They're
Sure.
still fantastic, but you just also want to make sure that you are getting those other ones that are really targeted to your niche audience. I mean, when you see things that move the needle on books and sales, it a lot of times are those hits that are, say you're writing a book, like a science book about like science literacy, and then there's a book about like communicating science, or podcast, or a Substack about communicating science. That can move a lot more books than just a general interest radio interview sometimes. So you really have to think about all the different audiences and then what kind of media they're listening to. So, you want to think about the topic, if there's any location involved, if there's any sort of like maybe there's like a craft of writing story and you can, pitch that story. But you want to think about all the different ways in and different types of media you can target. If there's different, maybe there's some Jewish themes, and then you can go to Jewish media. Maybe there's history. So you want to really be clear about that, and a lot of it is doing real deep dives. I mean, we talk about this a lot in our workshops, our book publicity workshops, like techniques for doing these really fruitful internet deep dives, which is a huge part of it. And like you said, there are no hacks. It's true. I mean, there are strategies. there are no
Sure.
quick fixes. There's no way, like there's no way around it.
Yeah.
To just it takes time. Even when we at Press Shop are working on full campaigns, we've been doing this for years, we've got a bajillion contacts. We still spend dozens and dozens of hours just diving down these internet rabbit holes, looking at this show and who is that person connected to, and oh, look, this person commented about that, and look at these other three journalists that are responding. Like, let's at them and see if they're interested. That's the kind of work that ends up being really fruitful, but it's
Yeah.
time consuming.
Yeah, I think what one of the things I take away from what we've discussed thus far is I mentioned how the author's job, for better or worse, has gotten more complex, more time consuming, more just complicated. But the reality is PR has gotten more complicated. I imagine that your day to day is much more busy, demands much more kind of scrutiny. And again, like we talked about earlier, it's not even talking about the good old days. It's just, pre-internet, there were only so many boxes you had to check because your NPR example, I think, is so spot on. Like if there was a certain amount of TV channels or a certain amount of newspapers, like you knew whether you were successful or not, you kind of knew you could leave it on the field and you knew that you had given your best shot. But now, and I think this is what even, as a writer that's been published, I worry all the time about. I think I'm taking my best shot, but am I absolutely missing micro communities here and there? Am I not using keywords right? Am I not attracting the communities that are looking for my book? And that's where I think when we talk about this kind of overflow of content, which again, on balance, it's democratization of culture, it's a good thing, but just getting lost in the noise, that I imagine is where you're really spending most of your time and earning your money, right? Because it hasn't gotten easier for anybody. That maybe that's, and I think that's what I'm getting at when I say there's no hacks. Like it's not like
Yeah.
someone's behind the throne going, there's new rules, and if you pay, this fee
Mm.
for the club,
Yeah.
there are successful authors that are like, I did everything I thought I could do, and I totally blew it. So it's kind of a helpless feeling unless you have an expert to help guide you through it.
Yeah, yeah, no, I mean it is there is a lot to it. There's also a lot, not only the the number of outlets and possibilities, but then you also are then having to come up you another challenge that you have to deal with is even when you find those people, they're also really bombarded because they're, getting a million emails and they're getting like notifications and pings and, so all of that you really need to like be navigating that. It's a wildly churning waters in every way. So, I think it is really important for authors when they are reaching out, first of all, to just know that you do have to come up, you have to just devote a certain chunk of time and, think of it as a little research job. This is what you're doing. You also have to sort of to try and divorce yourself emotionally from the outreach because that is really hard when you're an author. The book is your baby and it's hard not to take it personally if you send out 10 emails and you don't hear back and you're like, what's wrong with my baby? And no, there's nothing wrong. Probably nobody saw your email because they're, watching, the latest news drama or, whatever it is.
Right.
So that's another thing is it's really important not to just think, all right, this is what I'm doing. I'm reaching out to these people. There is nothing wrong with an author reaching out. Like you have to get
Yeah.
over that ick factor that so many authors feel like, oh, I don't want to be self-promotional. I don't want to be self-involved. No, like you wrote a great book. You put it out in the world. You have to let people know about it.
Right. Right.
Um, so you have to, just go forth with that in mind. Like I am spreading the news about my work, and I obviously think it is worth, being sent out there in the world. Otherwise, I wouldn't have written it. And then also, if you don't hear back, there are a million reasons. Maybe you went to their spam. Maybe they're on vacation. Maybe they went on maternity leave. Maybe they were distracted. There's a million things. Maybe they're on book leave. Maybe they're in the middle of another thing. You reach out to them a couple weeks later and you'll get a different answer. So, that's another mindset thing that's really important for authors. Um, And that's, it is always easier for a publicist because we know that it's not like we're going to take it personally. I mean, we'd be, you'd have to drag us off the floor if we took we took it personally all the time.
Yeah.
It's just the way it is. You know how it goes. Um, and you keep on going.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. Well, so we've purposely kept it kind of high level, which I appreciate. Kind of your very succinct kind of tour guide, exactly what I was hoping you'd be able to provide. But I want you to brag a little bit, and maybe we can get into the weeds a little, and you can talk about, maybe an example of what it was like, the work that you did, say, 15 years ago, how it's changed specifically, or if you want to talk about an example of a client, you don't have to say names if you don't want to, but just maybe talk us through like what's an effective strategy or what's something that you have become expert in that a lot of us wouldn't know about, and the process behind how to make a difference and how to make it stand out. Because obviously this isn't about throwing dartboard, the
Hmm.
darts at the dartboard hoping. There's a lot
Yeah.
of thought and a lot of deliberation that goes into this.
Yeah. I mean, I think everything starts with everything we do. Everything starts with the press materials and how you position your book. I mean, that is the biggest tool. Nobody's sending out the book unsolicited anymore, or not too often. That's another big change. In the past, there would be, the galley mailings and the final mailings, and it was like sending it out to these people to their desks. And then
Yep.
you see pictures of those desks, and it was like you wouldn't, not only would you not be able to consider every book, you wouldn't even be able to open every envelope. Like, Um, so, now almost all pitching is by email. So the biggest thing really is you have to make that pitch, the way you present your book, extremely, extremely compelling, very quick. You don't have much time. It needs to be tell the journalist what you want them to know right away. It needs to be story forward. You have to think whenever you're reaching out to a journalist, you have to sort of think, all right, what does the journalist need? What is the journalist looking for? How is the journalist thinking? Um, no journalist needs to cover your book. That's not their job. Their job is to come up with a great story for their readers or their listeners. And so if you can provide that and show that your book can provide that, or can provide a great jumping off point for a story, and you give them a hook, the positioning, that's the best shot. So I think that's always really the starting point. You want to make sure that you are positioning your book in the most effective way possible, that you're giving the journalist everything that they need to cover it. So who's publishing it? If it is traditionally published, make sure you say that right away, because every journalist gets so many pitches, and if it's self-published,
Yep.
they need to know that. So if it's not, tell them right away. Tell them the pub date, things like that. So that's, really, I think when it comes down to strategy, I think our strategy is almost always the same for every book. I mean, obviously the particulars change, but the strategy is getting the most compelling way, the newsiest way of presenting a book possible,
Right.
and getting that down to like 250 words, and then giving really compelling supplementary materials as well. And then on the other side, strategy wise, is okay, where are all the potential targets, where are all the potential readers getting their information, and trying to hit as many of them as possible. So obviously, the particulars of how to implement this strategy change from book to book, but at its core, and it kind of took me a little while. We've, worked on over 350 books, and at a certain point, I was like, you know what? This is the same with every book.
Okay.
You have to get the story, the pitch materials to be fantastic, and then you have to send them to the right people. Um, so that's, I would say, the key to almost everything we do.
Okay.
Um, and let's see, I'm trying to think. I know you had like a multi-part question there. And of course, I'm forgetting a little bit of the multi-part.
Well, I mean,
I think I
yeah,
answered A, but maybe not B and C.
I think you holistically kind of covered the whole question, which is, when we get into the actual weeds, it sounds like what you're saying is fundamentally a perfect pitch, and going to the right people. So I'm with you there. I would be curious, like, whether it's in your own personal experience or in general, is this easier with nonfiction or is it actually easier with fiction? Does it depend? I just
Mhm.
would imagine like with nonfiction, you have subject matter experts and they're able to say, here are my credentials. Whereas with fiction, you're talking about why this is going to interest people or why this is talking to particular
Yeah.
like cultural moment.
Right. Yeah, I mean, nonfiction is definitely much easier to promote for the reasons you said. And then also because it's easier for a journalist to cover them. It's easier because interviews are a huge part of any publicity campaign, and you need to show the producer that it's going to be an interesting conversation for their listeners, and it's just easier to do that for nonfiction. You can have a great conversation about whatever topic it is, and even if they're not going to buy the book, it can be very interesting. When you're pitching fiction, it's much harder. You have to, and one of the tricks to pitching fiction is making sure you share a lot of sort of nonfiction elements in the material so that they know that there's a really interesting conversation to be had that will be interesting to people who haven't read your book and who don't plan on reading your book. So that's, you know, part of why fiction is harder. And then the other thing too is, um, in order to evaluate whether or not they want to cover a book, a journalist's, wants to make sure it's good, like it's high quality, and it's just much easier to tell in a nonfiction book. And again, this might sound horrible, but without reading the whole book, you can tell like, oh, this is a great book. I see that this is really interesting. They know their subject matter. You can pop around from chapter to chapter. And a novel you can't. So it's just, producers don't have time to read 12 novels a week to decide which one to feature.
Right.
So that's part of the reason that fiction is much harder to promote. When you do have fiction, you have to think about all the different ways in, and also, you know, make sure to include a Q&A that shows the kind of interview you can have and how it's going to be really interesting. Like, what kind of themes can you talk about from your book that are going to be interesting, whether or not anyone reads your book, has ever read that genre or plans to. Um, so that's one thing that you can do if you are, promoting fiction.
Yeah, and when you work with clients, Leah, I'm curious, like that made me think of, speaking about branding and marketing. Is cynical or disingenuous as it might sound to either the hardened reader and writer or the novice, the reality is when one works on a brand and either has a podcast or a Substack or a blog, some of these outreaches might not even be for the book, or the ultimate reward isn't even a book sale, right? Where before, again, it was very transparent. You sell enough books, you make this amount of money, and maybe you teach or something, or somebody makes a movie out of it. But the reality now is it could lead to speaking gigs. It could lead to opportunities to teach or be on a news show of some sort. But like even thinking inside the box of I need to sell this book, right? Like this is all this intersection we talked about of media and all these kind of interesting and potentially unexpected opportunities and avenues one could go down if one has really taken the time to refine, like, what is their pitch? What are they talking about? What is the message? What is someone going to take away from this? I just love the way you mentioned that someone might not be interested in reading the book, but they're going to be interested in the interview. I think that's revelatory when we're talking
Mhm.
about the book market, because again, 20 years ago that would have sounded sacrilegious, but it's
Mhm.
the reality, and I don't even think it has to be an unfortunate reality. I think there's actually a lot of opportunity there.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of the people, most of the authors that come to work with us at Press Shop it's not, they don't have a single goal. It's not just about selling books. And in fact, when it is, it always, I'm always hesitant and have to really evaluate the project because publicity absolutely impacts sales, but it's also not sufficient to move sales. To do sales, you also need distribution. You might need marketing, advertising, from the publisher. So publicity is one piece. But most authors have a lot of different goals. So maybe it's book sales are almost always one of them, but maybe it's also, like you said, paid speaking engagements, or maybe it's just showing that this book is getting a lot of attention, and you are a really proactive author in the effort to get an agent for your next book, or if you have an agent, to get a publisher for your next book, or to get a bigger advance for your next book. Also, people, professors up for tenure, or, other people looking for a job. Sometimes there's an organization, like a mission-based organization, that they just want to call attention to. So there's a lot of different goals, and a lot of things that publicity can help with. And in, like you said, in this kind of environment where everything is, you know, in flux, it works well for that. You have to be out there. You have to, in order to get opportunities, you need to be findable, and you're findable if you get out there.
Right. Right. And I think, the other thing I would take away from all you're saying is in some very welcome ways, this is kind of the antidote for the folks who understandably might feel like, because it's the old cliche, but people that haven't had success, I will say it's a exclusive club. If you didn't get an MFA from this school, you don't live in New York City, they're not interested in you. And I think everything that you're talking about and all the work that you do proves that not only, of course, is that not the case. Most people are absolutely looking for a good story or a good angle, but there are these other opportunities to stand out that in some ways being a subject matter expert or having a specific kind of more 20th century brand and platform, that doesn't really work anymore. People want people that can connect the dots, that are at least comfortable with the way the world has changed. So I think there's been more opportunity than there ever has for a so-called nobody to have a voice that's just as authentic or valid. I find that very empowering, even if it's a little naive of me.
hmm Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think, the other thing that non this works better for nonfiction, but if you are a subject matter expert and then you start cultivating different contacts or journalists that are interested in this field, maybe you pitch them on your book, maybe they covered it, maybe they didn't. But then, a news story breaks in your space, and then you can reach back out to them and say, like, hey, I was in touch with you last year about blah, blah book. This just happened. Here's some talking points I can share if you want to talk to me. And then, like, list out like a couple talking points, something that you can add to the story uniquely because of your expertise. And that sort of goes back to thinking like a journalist. Like, what do they need? A journalist needs to cover this story, and they need an expert, and they need an expert to say something interesting. So if you can all of a sudden be like, hey, I'm an expert with something super interesting, here it is at the right moment, that's a great way to get attention.
Yeah. Well, so when I first read your bio and we started chatting, I mean, I knew, right? The proof is in the pudding. But whenever I have a chance, I try to invoke. I was on a panel several years ago, but not that long ago, and it was one of the millions of agent Q&A panels, and I was moderating it. And as it happened, it was refreshing. There were a couple of younger women. In fact, it was all women agents, but there was one older, more experienced agent who had had some big clients, and somebody in the audience asked, I'm really, trying to figure all these things we're hearing out and all these different things I should do. And she's this classic moment that I wish I had on tape. She both like completely disrespected the audience and the other agents by she basically said, look, all this is great, but in my experience, you write a good book and the talent will rise and everything else will take care of itself. You clearly just you're philosophically are from a whole different place. And I'd be remiss to not talk to you a little bit about book publicity school and in addition to wanting to be great at what you do and get good books in the world, like you clearly care about informing and educating. In fact, I want to say you've talked about, on your site, helping authors at more price points to make things more inclusive. Those can be cynical buzzwords, but we're talking about community, inclusivity, price points. You're that person. So maybe talk a little bit about your whole philosophy in terms of trying to help where possible and obviously take on great clients when it's a mutual fit.
Yeah, I mean, so at Press Shop, Press Shop is where we do all of our full campaigns. We love it. Like you said, it's really about, finding these great fits and helping to get fantastic books that we believe in out into the world. But I've also been doing this for a really long time, and there's so many people that come to us at Press Shop that we can't take on for any number of reasons. Um, no beating around the bush, doing full media campaign by a literary publicist, it's expensive. It doesn't work for everybody. So, a lot of people come, they don't have a big enough budget. A lot of people come and it's too late. We're full. There just aren't as many independent book publicists as there is demand for the service.
Yeah,
Maybe it's a book that, like we think is good, but it's just not one that's going to fit into our portfolio. There's a million reasons. So,
sure.
I was really trying to figure out for years, like, what is the best way to help authors? I love the teaching part of it. I love the strategizing part. I love talking with authors. So I was always sort of trying to figure out how we can offer, support to authors at a lower price point that would be meaningful for them and that would be effective. So that's how we and why we started book publicity school about 2 years ago. Um, Basically, it is we take all of the insights and strategies and everything we learn and have learned over the years at Press Shop. We're a team of five, so all of us are doing this every day. Every day we're like right at this intersection, writing these pitches, navigating media. So we take all of that, expertise and share it with authors in the form of workshops and coaching. And show them how exactly they can do it themselves. It's not that they're going to be able to completely mimic a professional publicity campaign, but there's still a lot you can do. And at a time when publishers require authors to do so much, and for all the reasons we discussed earlier in this interview, that authors need to do a lot. But then so many of them are like, well, I have no idea how to do that. I'm an author. I'm not a publicist. I'm not a marketer. I'm not a business person. I hate spreadsheets and, any number of things.
Sure. Yeah.
Um, so how are you supposed to effectively navigate these two really opaque spaces? Publishing is a opaque and somewhat intimidating space. Same with media. And then authors are all of a sudden thrown into this intersection at this really intense emotional time for them because, again, this baby that they've been working on and that they feel so strongly about is hitting the world. And you put them into this space and you're like, okay, go promote it. How do you do that? So that's really where we come in, and that's where we're trying to meet authors right in that space. Like, okay, we know this is what you're tasked with. This is your situation. Here's what you can do. And there is so much advice online, but it's too much advice. You don't know what applies to you, what you should do, what's a waste of time. So we really try to keep these workshops and these cohorts really small so that you can be like, hey, like Mary, you listen to this, like, but Bob, this isn't for you. We'll talk about the best thing for you in a minute. So.
Yeah.
So that's what
And
we do with book publicity school, and it's really fun. I love it. I didn't actually realize I love teaching until I started doing it.
see, that's so wonderful. And that gets to two things. I was going to ask a question, but also ask you to talk a little bit about that. That really does get to the community aspect and how we talk about the literary community being a literary citizen. Obviously, there are selfish reasons we do what we do, both as creatives and as part of the industry, whatever role we play. But I always seize any opportunity to talk about there is a selfless element, but there's also a very beautifully selfish. The more you pay it forward, the more interesting people you meet. You try to lift up other authors. It invariably improves your world, and not in a karmic or quid pro quo, but just rather than try to secure your own little piece of turf, trying to enlarge the playing field, it just inexorably leads to better results for more people, but it's also a way to stay
Okay.
sane in a super
Sure.
competitive landscape filled with rejection. So this
Mhm.
notion of community is so vital, but also I'm imagining even in the things you're doing, right? In the book publicity school, those people are meeting each other and forming their own micro communities and able to network and connect. So it is kind of this conflagration of minds and all of this vulnerability. It's like let's put that into the service of helping each other. Personally, I could care less if anyone thinks that's corny. I've seen it
Yeah.
work. You're
Yeah.
explaining how it
Yeah.
works, but
Oh
yeah,
my
talk a
God.
little bit about community and how you see it play out.
Yeah, I mean, for part of our workshops, we actually have a community group for a private community group, and it's wonderful. The authors do support each other. A lot of, when I was talking about writing those really compelling pitches, part of that is getting feedback from other people because as an author, ins and outs of your book and the breadth of it, and it's really hard to figure out how and what is going to land with other people. So, you know, you all of a sudden are with a bunch of authors and they can give you good feedback. Like they, even if they're not a publicist, they know if something resonates or if something kind of confuses them and they don't exactly know what the book is about or so that's one really great element. And they're just also really, supportive of each other and giving feedback and it's definitely a really lovely element of the group.
That's so great to hear. I'm just curious, is there both in the day in and day out, but via the book publicity school, are there like a handful of common themes or concerns or questions that people have that we could tee up here that you could give a free piece of wisdom
Yeah,
to the
yeah,
audience?
yeah. Let's see. I mean, people obviously ask about social media all the time and about if they need an author website. Those are two big questions. Yes, you need an author website. Absolutely. It is the one place online, the one and only place online where you are in control of the narrative. You can put forth yourself exactly as you want to position yourself and your book. So yes, website,
Yeah.
absolutely. Um, and then social media, you know, authors get a lot of really stressful advice about social media. Namely, you have to promote your book on social media and just like bop them over the head with that advice, but with no details, with no nuance, with no caveats. And there are a lot of caveats. And it doesn't really make sense for every author to, if they don't have a social media presence, they don't like social media, to all of a sudden expect social media to come in and save the day, and also for them to even get any results unless they plan on, working on it for months and months and months and put hours and hours and hours in. You don't get anything out of social media unless you do that. So which isn't to say that if you have, a LinkedIn presence that you shouldn't try to grow it or Instagram or what the different networks you have. Absolutely nurture them, grow them. But if that's not your thing, it's probably not going to be the thing that saves your book campaign.
Right.
It's one element, um, and there are many others as well.
Yeah, I think what we talked about earlier, where the playing field is now laden with opportunity. I think it's a general safe rule to follow that if you're not going to be able to perform some of those tasks with joy, it's probably not going to feel or be authentic. So you probably can afford, like if you're just not an Instagram person, you may lose some sales, but like if you're not willing to cultivate an audience there, don't bother. But I agree with you, I mean, completely as it relates to like a website and having some kind of presence. People need to be able to find you. And I think the biggest mistake that any writer makes is you're really dropping the ball if someone wants to get a hold of you and they don't know how to or they're
Mhm.
unable to.
Yeah, and then the other thing too is that if you are not a big social media person and you don't have a website, then other people who are social media people can't really effectively promote your book either. If you have a website and you have a friend with like 80,000 followers that might be interested in your book and they want to post about it, like have them be able to see your website.
Right.
I mean, I guess they can send them to Amazon or bookshop.org, but um, you want a storefront that you can send people to.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. I think the biggest question I see raised in with the conversations I either have or hear about are people or writers that struggle with how to get reviews and even more cringy, how to ask friends and family to write reviews.
Yeah.
I have to imagine you help people navigate those potentially troubling waters. Any
Yeah.
thoughts or words of advice for people that are struggling with that?
Yeah. People struggle with that quite a bit.
Yeah.
I think, I mean, first of all, trying, like I was saying earlier, like separating from yourself a little bit. Like you're promoting your work. Like kind of if you do a little exercise of a friend telling you about this their art exhibition, they've been working for years on all their work and it's finally open. And then you were like, well, okay, how are you going to spread the word? And they're like, well, no, I just don't feel comfortable. You'd be like, what? Of course you have to. Like, how are people going to know to go get your see your art?
Yeah.
And it's the same with the book. You wrote a book. How are you going to tell people? You have to tell people. So that's one piece. I would say another piece is uh, people do it all the time, and it is most likely not going to land in people's inbox who have never received such an email. So that's another thing. And then the third thing is, you can do it in your voice, throw in a few self-deprecating jokes if you need to. You can say like, this is a nightmare for me, but I'm going to do it anyway. Um, those emails to your friend and family should sound like you. So if you are somebody who doesn't like promoting, you can find a way to say it in a way that is disarming and you feel okay about. I'm guessing. I know you can.
No, that's great to hear. And I think the only other thing I'll add is I think then the other extreme, which we all know are the people that don't suffer from the self-deprecation, and they turn all of their social feeds into a relentless promotional apparatus. I, I think most people see that and instinctively recoil, but I've tried to caution writers that I know like that can actually be like counter effective if you're
Mhm.
seen as only caring about like everyone's going to give you a week or two of grace, or maybe more, as they should if they're any kind of friend, or fan. This is your moment. But making it all about you and just being relentless, it can have the opposite effect. So, lest we be accused of saying it's all about promotion and you have to find strategies, everything we've talked about, I think, is completely valid and worthwhile. But that is an overcorrection that I think people may not realize can
Totally. I
actually
think
really
that's a
hurt their
really
reputation.
good way to put it. It's an overcorrection. And when people do recoil at the idea of sending out that email, I think you're right. It's because they're thinking about their reactions to the over promoters. But one email to people that know you is nothing like that.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, as expected, 60 minutes can fly by. Is there anything that I didn't ask that you're thinking like, yeah, but I wanted to mention this because I feel like you covered the soup and nuts, but
Oh my God. Well, I guess one thing I didn't mention is that we do a free workshop monthly where I talk more about this stuff at Book Publicity School. Anybody can sign up. We do a Q&A. Anyone who has questions, we open up the last like 20 to 25 minutes to questions. So that is our Book Publicity 101, and it's once a month, usually around 9th, 10th, 11th, but it's on the website.
perfect. And of course, when we do our promotion here, I'll provide ample links to all of this stuff. But Leah, people are trying to find you online. How do they find you? Quick and easy.
Yeah, so I guess our website's Press Shop PR. That one is three S's, two P's. People always miss that. Press Shop PR. Bookpublicityschool.com. That one is a little more straightforward. And then I'm also on LinkedIn with my full name, Leah Paulos.
Awesome. Well, Leah, let me just tell you from the heart that, as someone that's kind of immersed in this world, there is, of course, a lot of solitude, there rejection, there's a decent amount of cynicism, there's a lot of fear right now about what's going on. The only thing that's going to save good books, good story are good literary citizens that are doing good work, which is its own reward, and they should be rewarded for it and recognized. But the ones that really take the extra responsibility to try to inform and inspire. You clearly do that. So, on behalf of the literary community that I'm in touch with, I want to thank you. It's making a difference, and it's giving so many writers out there some guidance in a world that I think a lot of people are trying to navigate. some pretty stormy waters and they don't know. So I certainly am going to feel very good about pointing them in your direction. But just the free information you provided today has just been so helpful and so positive.
Oh, well, I am so happy to hear that. And thank you so much. What a lovely, lovely way to end my workday, or almost end my workday. Not quite, but
PR, PR agents never stop working. Isn't that
this
the reality?
this is true, but I have to go
Well,
get my kids from camp, so
if
that's gonna
if 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 I ran the world, I'd give you the rest of the week off. So take,
well,
take,
I wish you ran the world, to be
take
honest. That sounds amazing.
for whatever it's worth. Well, here, open invitation. Be great to check back in with you and see what's changed in the next year or so.
That sounds great.
And have a regular feature where we're able to kind of really chop it up about the different aspects of the industry. Because again, today was by design a very high level, but I have a feeling if you and me got going, we could really get into some interesting case studies. But
Yeah.
I want to thank you for sharing your knowledge and being generous enough to be here today. So, Leah, thank you. All the best as you continue to help bring great writers into our consciousness.
Thank you so much. And I would love to come back anytime. It was a real joy.
Awesome. Awesome. Well, folks, thank you for checking out Some Things Considered. Again, this is the podcast where we are obsessed with story. We love creativity and creatives. If you know someone that should be talking to me, let me know. Share and subscribe, and we'll see you soon. Be safe and be well. Thanks for tuning in to Some Things Considered. Find out more, including how to be a guest, at seanmurphy.net. Reminder, we are obsessed with story and celebrating creativity. Also, we're here to advocate for the arts by any means necessary. Drop us a line, get involved, and support our creatives who are the lifeblood of our culture. I'm Sean Murphy. See you on the next episode of Some Things Considered.